At dawn on June 5, 1942, a classified telegram was delivered to the British Admiralty in London. The clock showed just after 3 in the morning. The night duty officer stood alone in the narrow watchroom, pale yellow light spilling from a lamp onto a wooden desk crowded with files. Outside, London lay buried in the heavy silence of war, no streetlights. No traffic, only the wind slipping through streets sealed behind blackout curtains. The wall clock ticked steadily, each beat seeming to stretch the fatigue of a war with no visible end. When the courier knocked, he barely looked up. Messages from the Pacific rarely carried good news these days. They were usually reports of withdrawals, lists of ships sunk, or bases placed on emergency alert. The British Empire had grown accustomed to losing pieces, slowly, but inexorably. The envelope placed on the desk bore an unfamiliar seal, not from the Royal Navy, but from the United States Navy. The bold words, "Top secret," made him sigh. An ally still learning how to fight on the oceans. He thought, perhaps another casualty report, or a request for support that London no longer had the means to provide. He carefully slit the envelope open and removed a thin sheet of telegram paper. Densely typed, concise to the point of coldness. There was no introduction, no emotion, only the stark facts of naval warfare. Battle engagement Central Pacific confirmed. 4 enemy carriers sunk. USS Yorktown lost. Japanese forces in full retreat. He read it once, then stopped. He read it a second time, more slowly, as though his eyes had made a mistake. 4 carriers, not escorts, not cruisers, fleet carriers, the backbone of Japanese power. The ships that had set Pearl Harbor ablaze, driven the Royal Navy out of Southeast Asia, and brought about the fall of Singapore without meaningful resistance. 1 American carrier lost, Yorktown. That fit the logic of war. No victory came without cost. But that price, measured against what Japan had lost, was impossible to comprehend. He placed the paper on the desk, his fingers still gripping its edge as if to be certain it was real. In his mind, numbers assembled automatically: aircraft, pilots, sailors, Japan's capacity to replace them. This was not a minor victory. This was a severing blow. At the bottom of the telegram was a shorter line, as if the sender himself dared not claim too much. Claims awaiting full confirmation. Awaiting confirmation. The phrase held him suspended between hope and doubt. In war, initial reports were often exaggerated. Everyone knew that, but if even half of what the telegram stated was true, the balance in the Pacific had shifted in a dangerous way, not only for Japan, but for the entire order Britain had once controlled. The duty officer stood up and straightened his wrinkled collar. He understood that he was holding a piece of paper capable of changing the way the war map would be drawn, not in red or blue ink, but in terms of who still had the ability to strike, and who could only endure. He folded the telegram, returned it to the envelope, and stepped into the darkened corridor. The 3 flights of stairs ahead had never seemed so long. Each footstep echoed sharply through the silent building, carrying a thought no one dared voice aloud. In nearly 2 decades of naval intelligence work, he understood exactly what those numbers meant. Japan had brought 6 carriers to Pearl Harbor, the force that had crippled the American fleet in a single morning and driven the Western powers into desperate defense. And now, in a single battle, the Americans had destroyed almost all of it. He carried the telegram down multiple flights of stairs, through corridors dimmed by blackout regulations, to the office of the First Sea Lord, Admiral Dudley Pound. Pound took the telegram in both hands and stood motionless beneath the small desk lamp, casting light onto the dark wooden surface. The light was too weak to dispel the shadows filling the room, just as it could not dispel the sense of deadlock that had weighed on him for months. War had worn him down faster than age. His hair had turned prematurely white, his shoulders sagged, and his eyes were red from lack of sleep, the eyes of a man carrying entire oceans on his back. He read each line slowly, carefully, as though reading too quickly might cause the victory to dissolve. Then he read it again, and a third time, not because he failed to understand, but because he did not dare believe it. Behind him, enormous maps covered the walls, pinned with colored tacks, strings, and chalk markings. They were no longer maps of the world. They were maps of depletion. The Atlantic appeared as a bleeding wound. Shipping lanes from North America to Britain were pierced with black dots, German submarines. Each dot represented a sunken ship, a crew that would never return, a ration removed from Britain's table. Pound knew all too well, if the Atlantic broke, Britain would not be invaded, Britain would starve. He turned to the Mediterranean map. North Africa was crowded with red and blue arrows locked in weary stalemate. British forces were retreating, step by step, before Rommel. Malta glimmered like a fragile ember in the sea, surviving on willpower more than supply. Every escort sent here was one missing elsewhere. There were no choices without cost. Then his gaze stopped on the third map. The Indian Ocean. No pins, no strains, no arrows. A cold emptiness stretched from the East African coast to India, from the Bay of Bengal to islands that had once flown the British flag. On paper, it was a quiet ocean. In reality, it was a confession. The Royal Navy had withdrawn, not because it had lost a decisive battle, but because it no longer had the strength to remain. Singapore was gone. Ceylon was threatened. The Eastern Fleet had retreated as far as Africa, leaving behind a vacuum Japan could fill whenever it chose. Pound clenched the telegram. He understood better than anyone that Britain was fighting beyond its limits. 3 oceans, 1 empire, a navy worn down by 2 years of continuous war. He silently recited numbers without consulting any documents. Carriers operational, ships under repair, sailors divided across how many fronts. Every decision was no longer a choice between victory and defeat, but a choice of where collapse would not occur. Then he looked again at the telegram from the Americans. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. A part of him felt lighter, a rare sensation of hope after months filled only with reports of loss. If this was true, Japan would not be able to range freely across the Indian Ocean for a long time. If this was true, India could breathe. But that feeling came with a harder truth. This victory was not Britain's. Pound placed the telegram on the desk, braced both hands against the wood, and bowed his head for a moment. He did not pray. He did not celebrate. He merely acknowledged what every British admiral avoided saying aloud. The Royal Navy no longer possessed the strength to decide the empire's fate on its own. If the Americans had truly accomplished this, then the war had changed, not only because Japan was weakened, but because a new naval power had come of age. Pound straightened and called for his aide. His voice was low and hoarse, but firm. Prepare a report for the Prime Minister. And call the operations rooms. If this telegram is true, we must recalculate the entire strategy. Outside, London remained dark. No fireworks, no cheers. But inside that room, among the map-covered walls, the British Empire quietly stepped into a different era, one in which its survival depended on the strength of others. Singapore had fallen, not like a fortress crushed after months of siege, but like a symbol stripped away in a matter of weeks. For the British, it was not merely the loss of a base. It was the collapse of a belief nurtured across generations. For decades, Singapore had been called the Gibraltar of the East, an impregnable fortress. The strategic anchor holding Britain's Asian empire together. Massive coastal guns faced the sea. Thick concrete emplacements. Enormous fuel depots. Deep water harbors capable of hosting any fleet. On the map, it was a cornerstone. In the minds of planners in London, it was a promise. Whatever happened, British power in Asia would stand. But modern war did not follow maps. In December 1941, Japanese forces did not attack Singapore from the sea, as the British had expected. They landed in northern Malaya and advanced down the peninsula using bicycles, light infantry, and overwhelming air superiority. The jungle, which British planners had considered a natural obstacle, became a highway for a disciplined, mobile force. British air power was wiped out in the opening days. No skies, no reconnaissance, no support. Defensive lines collapsed piece by piece. Not for lack of courage, but because there was no capacity to withstand an enemy that had mastered mobile warfare and air power. When Japanese troops closed in on Singapore, a brutal truth became clear. The fortress's great guns were aimed at the sea and were largely useless against an attack from land. The weapons once thought invincible now stood as relics of an obsolete doctrine. On February 15, 1942. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival signed the surrender document. More than 60,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops laid down their arms. It was the largest surrender in British military history. There was no final stand. No heroic moment. Only exhaustion, lack of water, lack of ammunition, and a desperate decision to avoid the massacre of civilians. News of Singapore reached London like an electric shock. Not only because of the number of prisoners, but because of what it represented. If Singapore could fall, then nowhere in Asia was safe. The entire structure of British power in the Far East was exposed as hollow. And the next blow came almost immediately. The battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse, the final symbols of British naval power in the Pacific, were sunk by Japanese aircraft off the coast of Malaya. No carrier cover, no air protection. Both ships were destroyed within hours by a force that understood the age of the battleship was over. The Eastern Fleet withdrew in stages, not because it lost a decisive battle, but because every attempt to stand its ground would have meant suicide. From Singapore to Ceylon, from Ceylon to East Africa, each step back tore away another piece of power. Japan did not need to occupy everything. It only needed to make Britain unwilling to stay. The fall of Singapore did not just cost a base. It destroyed credibility. Colonies looked at it and understood the empire was no longer omnipotent. Allies looked at it and saw Britain had reached its limits. Enemies looked at it and saw an open door. And then, in that context, the United States, from across the ocean, announced it had defeated the very enemy that had erased British power in Asia. 4 Japanese carriers destroyed. The fleet that had spread terror from Pearl Harbor to Singapore had been stopped. For British commanders, the feeling was bitterly mixed: relief that the threat had been checked, and pain at the realization that they were not the ones who had done it. Singapore had fallen because war had changed faster than imperial thinking. And Midway showed something even harder to accept. The new world of naval warfare would be shaped by those nations flexible enough, industrial enough, and bold enough to adapt, not necessarily by empires that once dominated it. As the morning wore on toward midday, additional telegrams began to pour into the Admiralty. No longer a single cold summary, but a cascade of analytical reports, fragmented pieces gradually locking together into a coherent picture. And a disturbing one. British operations officers sat around a long table. Maps spread edge to edge. Rulers, pencils, and piles of cigarette butts scattered about. Few words were spoken. Each man understood that they were witnessing a leap forward in the art of naval warfare. The first report addressed intelligence. Not rumor, not conjecture, but certainty, cold and precise. The Americans had known in advance that Japan's target was Midway. They knew the feint toward the Aleutians was merely a diversion. They knew the number of carriers involved, the order of movement, and the precise window in which the Japanese fleet would be forced to reveal itself. A British intelligence officer underlined a sentence in the analysis. Enemy intentions known in advance with high confidence. The room fell completely silent. To British eyes, the sentence carried meaning far beyond praise. There was only one plausible explanation: Japanese naval codes had been broken. Not partially, not temporarily, but deeply enough to plan an ambush. The second report examined operational calculation. The Americans had not deployed their forces to defend Midway. They had concealed their main strength. 3 carriers were positioned at a location absent from standard doctrine, northeast of the island, beyond Japan's expected reconnaissance range. The report included a diagram. Blue and red arrows intersecting like blades. One British operations officer murmured quietly, almost to himself, "This isn't luck, it's geometry." Too early, Japan would change course. Too late, Midway would fall before counterstrike. The Americans had chosen the single moment where both risks were acceptable. The third report caused several men to look up from the maps. It concerned timing. The analysis did not shy away from technical detail. Japanese carriers were struck while their decks were crowded with aircraft being refueled. Bombs and torpedoes being transferred. The rearming cycle, a strength of Japanese doctrine, became a fatal vulnerability when attacked at precisely the wrong moment. One passage read, Attack achieved during maximum deck vulnerability. Not coincidence. Not weather. Not Japanese carelessness. But the result of Americans wagering everything on the accuracy of intelligence. The next report went deeper. And here the tone changed distinctly, from description to judgment. British officers recognized that the Americans had done what the Royal Navy had always hesitated to do. Concentrate carrier forces at a single point and stake everything on one throw of the dice. Had intelligence been wrong, they would have lost their entire Pacific carrier force. There was no reserve, no second line of defense. Hawaii would have been exposed. One officer wrote in the margin, "Risk accepted was absolute." And it was precisely that acceptance of risk that produced victory. When the documents were gathered, no one in the room spoke of luck anymore. Luck could not produce that degree of synchronization. Luck could not place bombs on flight decks at the 10th minute of a rearming cycle. Luck could not destroy 4 carriers in one morning. Finally, an internal memorandum was drafted, short, dry, unembellished. American victory at Midway represents deliberate operational design enabled by superior intelligence. That was how British command acknowledged the unspoken truth. The Americans had mastered a form of warfare the Royal Navy once led, and had surpassed it. The next report went further. And more bluntly. The operational capacity of the United States Navy in carrier warfare has reached parity with, and in certain respects exceeds, Royal Navy standards. The wording was deliberate, not diplomatic courtesy, not allied flattery, but a conclusion drawn from dissecting every aspect of Midway, force deployment, command flow, and the integration of intelligence with operations. Another memorandum pushed even further. The ability to concentrate force, accept strategic risk, and exploit intelligence now exceeds what we can deploy in the Far East. This line held the room longest. The Royal Navy had long prided itself on caution, on dispersal to preserve long-term strength. Midway demonstrated that excessive caution in a new era could equate to impotence. The Americans had done what British doctrine avoided: stake everything on a single decisive blow and win. Another internal note, marked, for internal circulation only. Abandoned restraint altogether. Future operations in the Far East, including the defense of India and Eastern Sea lanes, will depend primarily on United States naval power. This sentence effectively inverted a century of naval hierarchy. For generations, the Royal Navy guaranteed maritime security for allies. Now, Britain was the one being protected. And then came the conclusion, the sentence no one wished to write, but no one could avoid. The Royal Navy does not currently possess the capability to replicate a comparable victory against Japanese carrier forces. Not because of lack of courage. Not because of inferior officers. But because the mathematics of war had changed. Britain lacked carriers to concentrate. Lacked pilots trained for sustained high-intensity operations. Lacked the industrial depth to absorb catastrophic losses in a single battle. And most critically, lacked the capacity to commit its entire strategy to a single existential gamble. Senior officers read the words in silence. No one objected, no one softened the phrasing, because all understood this was not humiliation, it was measurement. One admiral scribbled a single line in the margin. The Americans have arrived. It was not praise. It was acknowledgement that a new naval power had matured, not on Britain's timeline, but on the timeline of total war, where failure allowed no learning curve. From that moment onward, strategic discussions in London took on a different tone. The question was no longer whether the United States could carry the Pacific, but how Britain must adjust its role within a new maritime order. Midway did not merely sink Japanese ships. It sank the last illusion that the Royal Navy remained the sole arbiter of the oceans. And what made the truth most unsettling was this. It arrived too quickly, just 6 months after a burning morning at Pearl Harbor. Winston Churchill received news of Midway during the darkest days of his premiership. Tobruk had just fallen. A fortress regarded as a symbol of British endurance in North Africa had collapsed in a matter of days. 30,000 men were taken prisoner. The press howled. Parliament murmured. Questions began to circulate, not about the battlefield, but about leadership itself. In the underground war room, Churchill stood before the world map, his cigar long since extinguished. German red arrows were driven deep into Egypt. Supply routes through the Mediterranean hung by a thread. In the Far East, vast empty spaces on the map were no longer distances, they were vacuums of power. It was in this context that the telegram from the Pacific was placed on his desk. There was little need for explanation. Churchill read quickly, but when he reached the final lines, he paused longer than necessary. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, the Japanese fleet in retreat. The order of the Pacific, at least for a moment, had been reversed. Churchill did not celebrate. He knew war too well to confuse relief with triumph. Midway had halted Japan's momentum toward the Indian Ocean. It blocked the direct threat to India, Australia, and the lifeline connecting Britain to what remained of its empire. It allowed London to breathe, something that only weeks earlier had seemed impossible. In other words, Midway had saved the British Empire. But Churchill also understood what the admirals did not need to commit to paper. Britain had not saved itself. That victory had not come from Singapore, not from Trincomalee, not from any fleet flying the white ensign. It came from ships bearing white stars, from officers who had never studied at Dartmouth, from a navy that only a year earlier many in London had dismissed as inexperienced. Churchill set the telegram down slowly. In his mind, decades spent constructing the image of an irreplaceable empire quietly collapsed, not with explosions, but with the inescapable logic of power. He understood that from this moment on, the war was no longer about whether Britain could endure, but about the role in which Britain would endure. An empire still possessing territory, still fielding armies, still flying its flag across continents. But command of the seas, the foundation of empire, had passed into other hands. Churchill, a man deeply attuned to historical destiny, understood that this was the price of defeating Hitler. If Britain wished to survive, it had to accept a new reality. Leadership would belong to the United States. And in the silence of the command room, suspended between news of defeat at Tobruk and news of victory at Midway, Churchill grasped the greatest paradox of his age. Britain had been saved by relinquishing its position of supremacy. In public statements, he praised the courage of American sailors, the bravery of American pilots, and the spirit of alliance. In private letters, the tone was markedly different. The balance of power had shifted. Britain's survival was now bound to American strength. Not on paper, but on the oceans. Midway was not merely a victory. It was the moment the British Empire realized it could endure, it could resist, but it could no longer win on its own. And from that day forward, the fate of the empire lay in the hands of carriers flying the stars, thousands of miles from London.